November 25, 1943, 20:49 hours, 50 nautical miles west of Makin Island, Gilbert Islands. Commander Gale Griggs gripped the bridge railing of USS Radford as the radar operator's voice cracked through the Combat Information Center speaker. Contact, surface vessel, 8 miles. Bearing 045. For 20 years, submarine commanders had relied on darkness as their sanctuary. Submerge at the first sign of an enemy destroyer. Wait in the depths, survive. The Imperial Japanese Navy's I-19 had perfected this dance across 18 months of war patrols. She had torpedoed the aircraft carrier Wasp, sent the destroyer O'Brien to the bottom, damaged the battleship North Carolina with a single torpedo salvo. Her crew of 105 men knew the ocean depths better than most submariners in the Pacific, but at 2100 hours on November 25th, when Radford's radar lost contact and Commander Griggs ordered his crew to general quarters, something fundamentally different was about to unfold. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The Fletcher-class destroyer USS Radford was not going to make a single depth charge attack and withdraw. She was going to hunt, for hours, through the darkness, until one of two things happened. The submarine surfaced. Or it died. What the crew of I-19 could not have understood was that they faced a new kind of destroyer, a ship designed not merely to screen carriers or bombard beaches, but to pursue submarines with industrial efficiency. Fletcher-class destroyers carried something no previous American destroyer possessed in adequate measure: endurance. Not just in fuel capacity or engine reliability, though they excelled at both. Endurance in the specific mathematics of anti-submarine warfare. The capacity to launch depth charge after depth charge, hour after hour, until the submarine's batteries died or its hull cracked or its crew's will finally broke. The Fletcher class had been designed in 1939 with a simple specification: 5 5-inch guns, 12 torpedoes. That last number seemed almost modest compared to Japanese escort vessels, which sometimes carried 300 depth charges. But American naval architects had calculated something the Japanese had not. 28 depth charges represented the minimum tactical load. The initial arsenal, standard American doctrine, called for ships to reload depth charges from magazines during extended operations. Fletcher-class destroyers were built with ammunition handling rooms specifically designed for rapid depth charge replenishment. 6 K-gun throwers mounted amidships, 2 depth charge racks mounted aft. Each rack could hold 10 300-pound Mark 7 depth charges. When those racks emptied, damage control parties wheeled replacement charges from below-deck magazines using specialized trolleys. The K-guns could be reloaded in under 2 minutes by trained crews. The entire process had been drilled into destroyer crews at anti-submarine warfare schools from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. The theoretical capacity was staggering. A Fletcher could carry and deploy over 200 depth charges if her magazines were fully stocked and her crew maintained the logistical rhythm of an extended hunt. 200 explosions, 200 opportunities to crack a submarine's pressure hull. 200 moments when the crew of a submerged boat waited in darkness, wondering if the next detonation would be close enough to kill them all. USS Radford's radar had painted I-19 at 8 miles. The submarine's captain made the decision every submarine commander made when detected on the surface: dive, disappear into the depths, wait for the destroyer to give up and move on. At 21:40 hours, Radford's sonar operator gained contact. The distinctive ping of active sonar reflecting off a steel hull 200 feet below the surface. Commander Griggs ordered the first attack run. The Fletcher-class destroyer's anti-submarine warfare capabilities went far beyond simple depth charge capacity. The ship's sophisticated sonar suite could track submarines at depths previous American destroyers could barely detect. The QC-type sonar, standard equipment on Fletchers by mid-war, provided accurate depth and bearing information. The Mark IA fire control computer calculated optimal depth charge settings based on target depth, ship speed, and water conditions. At 21:45 hours, Radford made her first pass over I-19's estimated position. The K-guns fired in sequence: port side, starboard side, port side, starboard side. 6 depth charges arced through the darkness, splashing into the Pacific 150 yards on either side of the ship. 2 more charges rolled off the stern racks. 8 explosions. 8 underwater shockwaves. 8 moments when I-19's hull groaned under pressure. Deep below, the crew of I-19 heard the familiar sounds: bang, boom, bang, boom. The metallic clang of the shockwave hitting the hull, followed by the thunder of the explosion itself. Experienced submariners could estimate distance by the interval between bang and boom. These charges were close. Not close enough to rupture the hull, but close enough to rattle equipment, close enough to spray insulation from overhead pipes, close enough to make every man aboard wonder how many more attacks the boat could survive. Commander Griggs ordered Radford around for another pass. The Japanese submarine captain ordered emergency deep, pushing I-19 down to 250 feet, beyond her normal operating depth but well within her theoretical maximum. The temperature inside the submarine climbed. Carbon dioxide levels rose. The crew maintained strict silence. No unnecessary movement, no talking. Every sound could betray their position to the destroyer hunting above. At 2200 hours, Radford dropped her second pattern: 6 K-gun charges, 2 rack charges, 8 more explosions. I-19's captain ordered a course change, trying to slip away from the destroyer's relentless sonar. But Radford's experienced sonar operator held contact. The submarine was slower underwater. The destroyer could circle, reposition, attack from a new angle. What distinguished Fletcher-class anti-submarine operations from earlier American efforts was not just technology or training. It was the willingness to maintain contact for hours, to expend dozens of depth charges in a single engagement, to accept that submarine hunting was not a matter of luck but persistence. Industrial warfare applied to anti-submarine tactics. By 22:30 hours, Radford had made 4 attack runs, 32 depth charges expended. The crew worked with mechanical precision. Damage control parties wheeled fresh charges from the magazines. K-gun crews loaded, armed, and prepared for the next pass. Fire control calculated new depth settings as I-19 maneuvered deeper, trying to find a thermal layer to hide behind. The mathematical reality of extended depth charge attacks was brutal. Each explosion created a sphere of lethal pressure. Close detonations within 20 feet could rupture a submarine's pressure hull immediately. Detonations within 50 feet could buckle plates, shatter equipment, flood compartments. Even more distant explosions created cumulative damage. Welds cracked, seams opened. Hull integrity degraded with each passing hour. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized endurance. Stay deep. Stay quiet. Wait for the destroyer to exhaust its depth charges and depart. But Fletcher-class destroyers had redefined the equation. They didn't exhaust their depth charges in 30 minutes of frantic attacks. They maintained pursuit for hours, for days if necessary. At 2300 hours, 5 hours into the engagement, Radford had made 7 attack runs, 56 depth charges expended, half her initial load, but the magazines below deck remained stocked. The crew continued their mechanical dance: wheel charges forward, load K-guns, set fuses, launch, reload, repeat. Inside I-19, conditions had become desperate. The air was foul with carbon dioxide. Temperature exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Battery charge was dropping toward critical levels. The captain faced an impossible choice: surface and fight with the deck gun, likely dying under Radford's 5-inch battery, or remain submerged and slowly suffocate as batteries died and life support failed. At midnight, Radford made her 8th attack run. This time, the sonar operator noted something different. The submarine contact had slowed. It was barely moving. Commander Griggs ordered another pass: tighter pattern, shallower depth settings. The submarine was losing its ability to maneuver. At 0 to 100 hours, November 26th, Radford launched her 9th attack. 8 more charges. The sonar operator reported breaking up noises, the distinctive sounds of a pressure hull failing, bulkheads collapsing, machinery tearing loose. At 0 to 140, a massive underwater explosion shook Radford's hull. The submarine's batteries had shorted, igniting fuel and triggering a catastrophic internal detonation. Oil and debris surfaced at 0 to 200 hours. I-19 was gone. All 105 crew members lost. The most successful Japanese submarine of the Guadalcanal campaign had been hunted to death by a single Fletcher-class destroyer in a 5-hour engagement that consumed over 70 depth charges. USS Radford's action against I-19 represented the maturation of American anti-submarine doctrine. The engagement followed a pattern that would be repeated across the Pacific through 1944 and 45. Radar detection, sonar tracking, persistent attacks, unlimited depth charge expenditure. Industrial warfare applied to submarine hunting. The Fletcher class had been conceived as a multi-role destroyer, surface combat, anti-aircraft screening, shore bombardment. But by late 1943, a specific capability had emerged as strategically decisive: the ability to hunt submarines not for minutes, but for hours, not with dozens of depth charges, but with hundreds if necessary, not until the destroyer's magazine emptied, but until the submarine died. The Japanese submarine force had entered the war with advantages the Imperial Navy considered decisive: superior oxygen-propelled torpedoes with ranges exceeding 20,000 yards, large fleet submarines capable of operations across the entire Pacific, experienced crews trained in long-range commerce raiding. But none of these advantages mattered against destroyers that could hunt for 72 hours without rest. USS England's remarkable performance in May 1944 demonstrated what concentrated anti-submarine operations could achieve. The destroyer escort, smaller than a Fletcher but equipped with similar persistence, sank 6 Japanese submarines in 12 days, I-16 on May 19th, RO-106 on May 22nd, RO-104 on May 23rd, RO-116 on May 24th, RO-108 on May 26th, RO-105 on May 31st. Each engagement followed similar patterns. Radar or intelligence provided initial contact. Sonar tracking refined the position. Hedgehog or depth charges began the attack. Then came the critical phase, the extended hunt, hours of persistent attacks, dozens of explosions, relentless pressure on a submarine crew that could not escape, could not counterattack, could only endure until batteries died or hull failed, or crew surrendered to inevitable defeat. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, had positioned 7 submarines in a scouting line north of the Admiralty Islands to detect American carrier movements. The submarines of the 7th Submarine Squadron were supposed to provide early warning for Operation Ago, Japan's planned decisive battle in the Philippine Sea. USS England destroyed 5 of those 7 submarines in 6 days. The scouting line collapsed. The early warning system failed. Toyoda, convinced that submarine losses indicated a major American presence near Tawi-Tawi, withdrew his fleet prematurely, disrupting Japanese battle plans. The impact cascaded through the Battle of the Philippine Sea. American carriers caught Japanese forces out of position. Navy fighters annihilated Japanese carrier aircraft in what pilots called the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Submarines USS Albacore and Kavala sank Japanese fleet carriers Taiho and Shokaku. The Japanese carrier air arm, already weakened, was effectively destroyed as an offensive force. The ability of Japanese submarines to provide strategic reconnaissance had been shattered by persistent American anti-submarine operations. Fletcher-class destroyer production statistics revealed American industrial advantage applied to anti-submarine warfare. 175 ships completed between June 1942 and February 1945. Average construction time, 8 months from keel laying to commissioning. Peak production. 11 destroyers commissioned in September 1943 alone. Each ship could carry over 200 depth charges if fully loaded for extended anti-submarine operations. The mathematics became overwhelming. 175 destroyers, 200 depth charges per ship if fully stocked, 35,000 depth charges available across the Fletcher class alone. That number excluded older destroyers, destroyer escorts, patrol craft, and aircraft-dropped depth bombs. The United States produced over 1 million depth charges during World War II. Japan produced approximately 30,000. Japanese submarines attempting to operate in American-controlled waters faced not just individual destroyers, but coordinated hunter-killer groups, multiple destroyers working together, sharing sonar contacts, coordinating attacks, maintaining continuous pressure. When one destroyer expended its depth charges, another continued the hunt. Submarines had nowhere to hide. The psychological impact on Japanese submarine crews was devastating. Pre-war doctrine had emphasized that darkness and depth provided sanctuary. Dive deep, stay quiet. The enemy destroyer will eventually give up. By mid-1944, Japanese submariners understood that American destroyers never gave up. They hunted for hours, for days, until the submarine surfaced or died. USS Fletcher herself demonstrated the class's anti-submarine capabilities during the Guadalcanal campaign. On February 11, 1943, Fletcher detected Japanese submarine I-18 near the Solomon Islands. An aircraft from cruiser Helena dropped a smoke float marking the submarine's position. Fletcher raced to the location and began a depth charge attack that lasted over 3 hours. 42 depth charges expended. I-18's pressure hull ruptured at depth. The submarine sank with all hands lost. The extended nature of American depth charge attacks created tactical dilemmas Japanese submarine doctrine could not resolve. If a submarine stayed deep after the initial attack, it faced hours of additional depth charging as the destroyer maintained sonar contact. Batteries would die, air would foul, the crew would slowly suffocate. If the submarine attempted to escape by moving, it revealed its position more clearly to sonar. If it surfaced to recharge batteries or escape, it faced instant destruction from radar-directed gunfire. Commander Tamichi Hara, one of the few Japanese destroyer captains to survive the war, wrote in his memoir about the growing effectiveness of American anti-submarine operations. He noted that by late 1943, Japanese submarines rarely survived encounters with American destroyers. The Americans would maintain contact for impossible lengths of time, dropping depth charge after depth charge until the submarine could no longer evade. The tactical doctrine that emerged in the American destroyer force emphasized systematic coverage over lucky hits. Standard anti-submarine attack patterns, code-named observant, beta, and creeping, were designed to blanket an area with depth charges set at varied depths. If the submarine went deep to avoid shallow-set charges, it encountered deeper patterns on the next pass. If it stayed shallow, the next attack would adjust. The submarine had no safe depth. Fletcher-class destroyers operating in the Central Pacific during the Marianas Campaign demonstrated the scalability of anti-submarine warfare. Multiple destroyers working together could maintain contact with a submarine for 72 hours or longer, rotating attacks to allow individual ships to reload from tenders while others continued the hunt. Japanese submarines attempting to interdict American invasion convoys found themselves hunted continuously by destroyer screens that never slept, never stopped, never ran out of depth charges. The logistical infrastructure supporting extended anti-submarine operations was itself a victory of American industrial organization. Depth charge production facilities operated around the clock. Specialized tenders accompanied fleet operations to reload destroyers at sea. Forward bases stockpiled thousands of depth charges. The entire system was designed around a simple principle. American destroyers would never stop hunting because they would never run out of weapons. Japanese submarine losses in 1944 reached catastrophic levels. January through March, 14 submarines lost. April through June, 23 submarines lost. July through September, 19 submarines lost. October through December, 18 submarines lost. Total for 1944, 74 submarines, representing nearly half the operational submarine force in the year's beginning. American destroyers, particularly Fletcher-class ships, accounted for a significant portion of these kills. The cumulative effect of persistent American anti-submarine operations extended beyond ship losses. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Japanese submarine crews that survived early war patrols became increasingly reluctant to engage American task forces. Submarines avoided areas with known destroyer presence. Transit times increased as submarines remained submerged for extended periods, sacrificing speed for safety. Operational effectiveness collapsed as the submarine force shifted from offensive operations to survival. By late 1944, Japanese submarines had essentially ceased effective operations in American-controlled waters. The submarine force that had begun the war with ambitious plans for commerce raiding and fleet engagements had been hunted nearly to extinction by destroyers that refused to stop, refused to exhaust their weapons, refused to grant the sanctuary that darkness and depth had once provided. USS Radford's 5-hour hunt of I-19 represented not an exception but standard procedure. American destroyer doctrine by late 1943 explicitly called for extended attacks. Maintain sonar contact. Continue depth charge attacks until submarine is destroyed or contact is definitively lost. Reload from magazines between attacks. Coordinate with other destroyers if available. Accept that submarine hunting was a marathon, not a sprint. The Fletcher-class destroyers transformed anti-submarine warfare from an art into a science, from a matter of luck into industrial process. Previous destroyer classes had hunted submarines with hope and limited weapons. Fletcher-class destroyers hunted submarines with mathematics and unlimited depth charges. The difference was decisive. When I-19's oil slick spread across the surface at dawn on November 26, 1943, USS Radford had been engaged in continuous anti-submarine operations for over 5 hours, 70 depth charges expended, 1 submarine destroyed, 105 enemy combatants killed. The crew of Radford secured from general quarters, reloaded their depth charge magazines from shipboard stores, and resumed their patrol. Within 48 hours, they would be ready to do it again, and again, and again. That capability, the ability to hunt not once but continuously, not with dozens but with hundreds of depth charges, not for minutes but for days, represented the Fletcher class's decisive contribution to anti-submarine warfare. Japanese submarines had nowhere to hide. No amount of diving could provide safety. No darkness offered sanctuary. American destroyers would hunt them until batteries died, air spoiled, and pressure hulls cracked under the relentless percussion of industrial warfare applied with mechanical precision. The Fletcher-class destroyer achieved something previous American destroyers could not. They made submarine operations in contested waters effectively impossible for an enemy that lacked comparable anti-submarine capabilities. They transformed the Pacific from an ocean where submarines could operate with relative freedom into a killing ground, where every submarine sortie might end in a multi-hour hunt, culminating in death by exhaustion. 29 Japanese submarines fell to Fletcher-class destroyers during World War II. Dozens more were damaged, forced to abandon patrols, driven from operational areas. The cumulative impact exceeded the simple mathematics of ships sunk. The Fletcher class had broken the back of Japanese submarine operations through persistence, industrial capacity, and the willingness to hunt for as long as necessary. The lesson was unambiguous. In modern naval warfare, endurance matters as much as firepower. The capacity to maintain operations for hours, for days, to expend hundreds of weapons if necessary, to refuse an enemy any sanctuary or respite, that capacity could be as decisive as any technological advantage. The Fletcher-class destroyer embodied that principle, and Japanese submarines paid the price in blood and steel across 3 years of increasingly one-sided combat. USS Radford earned 12 battle stars for World War II service. USS England received the Presidential Unit Citation. USS Fletcher herself earned 15 battle stars. But beyond individual decorations, the Fletcher class earned something more significant. They earned the reputation as submarine killers that never gave up, never ran out of weapons, and never granted their prey the mercy of exhaustion. The industrial mathematics of Fletcher-class anti-submarine warfare extended beyond individual engagements. The United States Navy commissioned 175 Fletcher-class destroyers between June 1942 and February 1945. Each ship represented not just firepower but persistence, the capacity to hunt submarines for 72 hours without resupply if necessary. To expend 200 depth charges across extended operations, to maintain sonar contact through thermal layers, course changes, and desperate evasive maneuvers by increasingly exhausted submarine crews. Japanese submarine production during the same period totaled 32 boats of all types. The disparity was staggering. For every Japanese submarine launched, the United States commissioned 5 Fletcher-class destroyers specifically designed to hunt them. The mathematical inevitability was brutal. Japanese submarines were being hunted by a force that outnumbered them, outgunned them, and most critically, could maintain pursuit far longer than any submarine's batteries could last. The tactical evolution of American anti-submarine doctrine between 1942 and 1945 reveals how Fletcher-class capabilities drove operational changes. Early war destroyer attacks typically involved a single pass, 8 to 16 depth charges, then withdrawal. By mid-1943, doctrine called for multiple passes until sonar contact was lost. By late 1943, doctrine explicitly stated, maintain contact and continue attacks until submarine is destroyed or confirmed escaped. Fletcher-class destroyers made this doctrinal evolution possible. Earlier destroyers lacked the depth charge capacity for extended operations. The Benson and Gleaves classes carried similar initial loads, but had less efficient magazine arrangements for rapid reloading. The Sims class, plagued by top-heavy design, had limited depth charge storage. Fletcher-class destroyers were designed from the keel up for extended anti-submarine operations. Large magazines, efficient handling equipment, trained crews drilled in rapid reload procedures. The impact on Japanese submarine tactics was immediate and devastating. By early 1944, Japanese submarine doctrine had shifted from offensive operations to survival. Submarine captains were ordered to avoid American destroyer screens entirely. When contact was unavoidable, they were instructed to dive immediately, go deep, maintain absolute silence, and pray the destroyer would give up after a few attacks. But American destroyers didn't give up. USS Nicholas, a Fletcher-class destroyer, demonstrated this on July 26, 1943. Sonar contact with a Japanese submarine off Kolombangara Island led to a depth charge attack that lasted over 4 hours. 53 depth charges expended. The submarine, later identified as I-18, attempted every evasion tactic, changed course repeatedly, went deep to 300 feet, released oil to simulate destruction. USS Nicholas maintained contact through every maneuver. At hour 4, breaking up noises confirmed the kill. The psychological warfare aspect of extended depth charge attacks was as important as the physical damage. Submarine crews endured hours of explosions. Each detonation triggered the same response. Bang, the shockwave hitting the hull. Boom, the explosion's sound wave. Close charges meant near-simultaneous bang-boom. Distant charges allowed time to estimate range. But even distant charges contributed to cumulative stress. Equipment shook loose. Light bulbs shattered. Insulation fell from overhead pipes. Temperature climbed. Carbon dioxide levels rose. After 2 hours of depth charge attacks, submarine crews began experiencing physical symptoms. Headaches from carbon dioxide buildup, dizziness from heat and poor air quality, exhaustion from stress and adrenaline. After 4 hours, rational decision-making became difficult. After 6 hours, many crew members became nearly incapacitated. Fletcher-class destroyers could maintain attacks for 8, 10, 12 hours if necessary. The submarine crew's will would break long before the destroyer's depth charge supply ran out. Japanese submarine WWII experienced this reality during Operation Galvanic, the American invasion of Tarawa and Makin, in November 1943. Ordered to attack the American invasion fleet, I-35 was detected by destroyer USS Frazier on November 20th. The resulting engagement lasted over 9 hours. Frazier and 2 other destroyers maintained rotating attacks, allowing each ship to reload while others continued the hunt. Over 120 depth charges were expended. I-35 attempted every evasion, changed depth repeatedly, released oil and debris, maneuvered through thermal layers. Nothing worked. At hour 9, the submarine's batteries finally died. Unable to maintain depth, I-35 broached the surface. Frazier's 5-inch guns destroyed her in minutes. The extended nature of American anti-submarine operations created a tactical environment where Japanese submarines simply could not survive. Previous naval warfare had assumed that destroyers would make a few attacks, then depart to resume their primary mission of screening capital ships. Fletcher-class operations inverted that assumption. Anti-submarine warfare became the primary mission. Screening became secondary. When a Fletcher-class destroyer gained sonar contact with a submarine, that submarine's destruction became the destroyer's sole focus until the job was finished. This shift in priorities reflected broader American strategic thinking about submarine threats. By late 1943, American intelligence had identified Japanese submarines as a strategic problem requiring systematic elimination. Japanese submarines threatened supply lines to forward bases. They attacked invasion convoys. They conducted reconnaissance that provided Japanese fleet commanders with tactical intelligence. Eliminating the submarine threat was worth dedicating significant destroyer assets to anti-submarine operations. Fletcher-class destroyers became the primary tool for that elimination. Their combination of sonar capability, depth charge capacity, and operational endurance made them ideal submarine hunters. Doctrine evolved to leverage these strengths. Hunter-killer groups formed specifically around Fletcher-class destroyers. Forward bases stockpiled depth charges to support extended operations. Training programs emphasized persistent attacks over single-pass engagements. The results were statistically overwhelming. In 1942, Japanese submarine losses totaled 19 boats. In 1943, losses climbed to 23 boats. In 1944, the catastrophic year when American destroyer production peaked and doctrinal evolution completed, Japanese submarine losses reached 74 boats. Fletcher-class destroyers accounted for a significant percentage of those kills, with 29 confirmed sinkings attributed to the class by war's end. But the impact extended beyond direct kills. Japanese submarines that survived encounters with Fletcher-class destroyers often returned to base damaged, their crews psychologically shaken. Patrol effectiveness declined. Submarines that might have spent weeks operating near American convoy routes instead spent days trying to evade persistent destroyer pursuit. The cumulative effect reduced Japanese submarine effectiveness far beyond simple attrition. USS Haggard, a Fletcher-class destroyer, demonstrated the class's ability to conduct anti-submarine operations under the most challenging conditions. On September 21, 1944, Haggard detected Japanese submarine RO-41 in the Philippine Sea during a typhoon. Seas ran 20 feet. Visibility was near zero. Standard doctrine called for breaking off anti-submarine operations in such conditions. Commander Ralph Waldo Christie, commanding Haggard, maintained pursuit. For 6 hours through mountainous seas, Haggard tracked the submarine by sonar, adjusted for storm conditions, and maintained depth charge attacks. 48 depth charges expended in conditions that made each attack technically challenging. At hour 6, breaking up noises confirmed the kill. RO-41 sank with all hands. The willingness to maintain anti-submarine operations, regardless of conditions, reflected a doctrinal commitment that previous destroyer forces had never achieved. Weather, visibility, time of day, fuel status, None of these factors were allowed to interrupt anti-submarine pursuit once sonar contact was established. Fletcher-class destroyers had the endurance to maintain operations through conditions that would have forced earlier destroyers to break off. This operational persistence created a strategic environment where Japanese submarines faced impossible odds. They could not evade detection once American destroyers gained radar or sonar contact. They could not outlast depth charge attacks because American destroyers carried effectively unlimited depth charge capacity relative to submarine battery endurance. They could not surface and fight because Fletcher-class destroyers mounted 5-inch guns that could destroy a surfaced submarine in minutes. They could not hide in storms or darkness because American radar and sonar worked in all conditions. They had no tactical options that ended in survival once an American destroyer began pursuit. Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto, captain of I-58, one of the few Japanese submarine commanders to survive the war, wrote in his post-war memoir about the transformation in American anti-submarine capabilities between 1942 and 1945. He noted that by late 1944, Japanese submariners understood that encountering an American destroyer meant almost certain death. The Americans would not stop. They would not run out of weapons. They would hunt until the submarine died. This psychological shift was as important as the tactical transformation. Japanese submarine crews that had entered the war with confidence in their boats and training now operated under crushing stress. Every patrol might end in a multi-hour depth charge attack that would continue until batteries died and the hull collapsed. That stress degraded performance. Submarine captains became overly cautious. Opportunities to attack American shipping were passed up to avoid detection. Patrol durations decreased as submarines returned to base prematurely, their crews unable to maintain the psychological endurance required for extended operations. The Fletcher-class contribution to American anti-submarine warfare extended beyond the Pacific. Although Fletcher-class destroyers served almost exclusively in the Pacific theater, their design philosophy influenced Atlantic anti-submarine operations. Destroyer escorts built for Atlantic convoy duty incorporated similar magazine arrangements and depth charge capacity. The doctrine of persistent attacks until target destruction became standard across all American anti-submarine forces. The technological foundation enabling extended anti-submarine operations was sophisticated but fundamentally industrial in nature. Fletcher-class destroyers mounted QC-series sonar capable of detecting submarines at ranges exceeding 2,000 yards. The sonar could track depth changes, allowing operators to estimate whether a submarine was attempting to go deeper or shallower. Fire control computers calculated optimal depth charge settings based on target depth and ship speed, but the critical technology was simpler. It was the design of magazine spaces that allowed rapid depth charge handling, the training of crews who could maintain mechanical precision during hour 8 of an engagement, the industrial capacity that kept those magazines stocked. Japanese anti-submarine forces never achieved comparable capabilities. Japanese destroyers carried fewer depth charges initially and had less efficient reload procedures. Japanese doctrine never evolved to emphasize extended operations. Japanese industrial capacity could not produce depth charges in quantities necessary for persistent attacks. When Japanese destroyers gained contact with American submarines, they typically made 1 or 2 attack runs before resuming their primary mission. American submarines learned that if they survived the initial attack, the Japanese destroyer would likely depart. Japanese submariners never learned that lesson about American destroyers. If you survived the initial attack from a Fletcher-class destroyer, it simply meant the engagement would last longer, not that survival was likely. The comparative statistics on depth charge expenditure reveal the gulf between American and Japanese anti-submarine doctrine. American destroyers that sank Japanese submarines typically expended 50 to 70 depth charges per kill. Some engagements required over 100 charges. Japanese destroyers that successfully sank American submarines typically expended 20 to 30 charges. The difference reflected not just tactical doctrine but strategic philosophy. American forces accepted that submarine hunting required industrial quantities of weapons. Japanese forces never made that conceptual leap. USS Moal, a Fletcher-class destroyer, provided perhaps the most dramatic example of extended anti-submarine operations. On November 7, 1943, Moale detected Japanese submarine RO-37 off Empress Augusta Bay. The engagement that followed lasted over 14 hours. Moale maintained sonar contact through the night and into the following morning. The submarine attempted every evasion, changed course 40 times, varied depth constantly, released oil and debris multiple times to simulate destruction. Moale's sonar operators maintained contact through every maneuver. By dawn, the destroyer had expended 92 depth charges. The submarine's evasions had become sluggish, indicating battery depletion. At 14 hours and 30 minutes, breaking up noises confirmed destruction. RO-37 sank with all hands. Moale had maintained pursuit for over 14 hours without resupply, without relief, without considering withdrawal. That engagement became a case study in American anti-submarine warfare schools. The tactical principle was clear. Maintain contact, continue attacks. Trust that submarine batteries will die before destroyer depth charges run out. The Fletcher class made that doctrine practical. Earlier destroyers might have maintained contact for 14 hours, but they would have exhausted their depth charge capacity by hour 6 or 7. Fletcher-class destroyers had the magazine capacity to maintain attacks for as long as sonar contact remained. The crew endurance required for such operations was itself remarkable. 14 hours at general quarters, 14 hours of sonar operators maintaining contact, 14 hours of depth charge handlers wheeling 300-pound charges from magazines, 14 hours of fire control calculating depth settings, 14 hours of K-gun crews loading and firing. The physical exhaustion was immense. But Fletcher-class crews had been trained for exactly this scenario. Anti-submarine warfare schools drilled crews in maintaining operations during hour 12, hour 15, hour 20 of simulated engagements. The training paid off in actual combat. Japanese submarine crews were not trained for comparable endurance. Japanese submarine doctrine emphasized brief encounters, followed by evasion. Extended operations, particularly at depth under attack, were considered unlikely. Japanese submariners had not been prepared psychologically or physically for engagements lasting 10, 12, 14 hours. When Fletcher-class destroyers forced them into such engagements, Japanese submarine crews found themselves fighting a type of warfare they had never trained for, against an enemy that seemed capable of attacking forever. The strategic implications extended to Japanese naval planning. By mid-1944, Japanese commanders understood that submarines could no longer operate effectively in American-controlled waters. Submarine reconnaissance became nearly impossible. Submarines attempting to attack American invasion convoys faced destroyer screens that would hunt them to destruction. Submarines trying to interdict American supply lines found themselves becoming targets rather than hunters. The submarine force that had begun the war as a strategic asset had been reduced to a liability that consumed resources and personnel without achieving meaningful results. Admiral Soemu Toyoda's decision to withdraw the combined fleet from Tawi-Tawi in June 1944 was directly influenced by submarine losses to American anti-submarine operations. The destruction of multiple submarines from the 7th Submarine Squadron convinced Toyoda that American destroyers had established an impenetrable anti-submarine cordon. The fleet withdrawal disrupted Operation A-Go planning and contributed to Japanese defeat at the Battle of the Rise, Philippine Sea. A series of individual anti-submarine engagements by Fletcher-class destroyers had accumulated into operational impact that influenced fleet-level decisions. This cascade effect, tactical success driving operational changes that shaped strategic outcomes, represented anti-submarine warfare's evolution from supporting mission to war-winning capability. Fletcher-class destroyers had not been designed to win battles through submarine hunting. They had been designed as multi-role vessels capable of anti-submarine warfare, among other missions. But their combination of sonar capability, depth charge capacity, and operational endurance transformed them into specialized submarine killers whose cumulative impact helped decide the Pacific War's outcome. The Fletcher class achieved something unprecedented in naval warfare. They made an entire category of enemy warship, the submarine, effectively obsolete as an offensive weapon. Japanese submarines continued operating through war's end, but by late 1944, they operated with the knowledge that encountering an American destroyer meant almost certain death. That knowledge degraded effectiveness far beyond what raw attrition numbers suggested. Submarines that spent more time evading than attacking, submarines that returned to base prematurely, submarines whose crews were psychologically broken before they even departed on patrol. These were the invisible casualties of Fletcher-class anti-submarine operations. USS Radford's hunt of I-19 on November 25, 1943, was not exceptional. It was representative. Dozens of similar engagements occurred across the Pacific between late 1943 and August 1945. Fletcher-class destroyers detected Japanese submarines, established sonar contact, and maintained depth-charge attacks for hours until the submarine was destroyed. Each engagement followed similar patterns: initial detection, first attack, submarine, evasion, continued pursuit, extended attacks, eventual destruction. The tactics became standardized, the outcomes predictable, the strategic impact cumulative. The industrial foundation enabling this transformation cannot be overstated. American shipyards produced 175 Fletcher-class destroyers in under 3 years. American munitions plants produced over 1 million depth charges during the war. American training schools processed thousands of sonar operators, depth charge handlers, and fire control technicians. The entire system was designed around a simple principle: American destroyers would never stop hunting because they would never run out of ships, weapons, or trained personnel. Japan could not match this industrial output. Japanese shipyards launched 32 submarines between 1942 and 1945. Japanese munitions production managed approximately 30,000 depth charges total. Japanese training programs could not replace submarine crews as fast as American destroyers were killing them. The mathematics were insurmountable. Every Japanese submarine faced an enemy that outnumbered it, outgunned it, and could sustain operations far longer than any submarine could hide. The Fletcher-class destroyer's contribution to victory in the Pacific War is typically discussed in terms of surface combat, anti-aircraft screening, and shore bombardment. These were important missions, but the class's most strategically significant contribution may have been anti-submarine warfare. The systematic elimination of Japanese submarine capabilities. The transformation of the Pacific from an ocean where submarines could operate with relative freedom into a killing ground where every submarine sortie might end in death by industrial attrition. 29 Japanese submarines sank beneath depth charges from Fletcher-class destroyers. 105 crew members died with I-19, 56 died with RO-37, 94 died with I-35. The numbers accumulated across 3 years of systematic submarine elimination. Each submarine represented not just a hull lost but experienced crews killed, operational capability destroyed, strategic options foreclosed. By war's end, the Japanese submarine force existed only as a shadow of its early war capability, broken by an enemy that had transformed anti-submarine warfare from an art into industrial process. The lesson transcended the specific technologies or tactics. Industrial warfare applied systematically could achieve results that individual heroism or tactical brilliance could not. Fletcher-class destroyers were not revolutionary in design. Their sonar was good but not miraculous. Their depth charges were standard weapons. Their crews were well trained but not superhuman. What made them devastating was the combination: good enough technology, adequate weapons in unlimited quantity, systematic doctrine, industrial production, training infrastructure, logistical support, all combined into a system that made Japanese submarine operations ultimately futile. USS Radford continued anti-submarine operations throughout 1944 and into 1945. She would earn 12 battle stars by war's end. USS Fletcher earned 15 battle stars. USS Nicholas earned 17 battle stars. Individual ships' accomplishments were remarkable, but the collective achievement of the Fletcher class was transformative. They had taken anti-submarine warfare from a supporting mission, performed with inadequate tools, into the war-winning capability that helped strangle Japanese naval operations and secure American control of the Pacific. The industrial mathematics were simple and brutal. Fletcher-class destroyers could hunt for 72 hours. Japanese submarines could hide for perhaps 12 hours before batteries died. The destroyers would always win, and they did, again and again and again, until Japanese submarines stopped being a strategic threat and became simply targets waiting to be found, hunted, and destroyed by an enemy that never stopped, never ran out of weapons, and never granted the mercy of exhaustion. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.